Last Tuesday was election day, and we had some conversations on air and I think as well off air here in the building because of the weather conditions around the state. We thought that on a day when, in one of these odd year elections, that you'd normally see a bit of a drop off in interest in voting, that would probably even be more hampered by the weather. But some of the numbers coming in from around the state might actually say that's not true. That for well, you didn't have a stampede of people going out to vote, but perhaps the turnout was fairly steady, and that was from some of the reading I did that following day. It's 8:44 at our studio. Our guest is Randy Stapilus. He's the publisher of Idaho Weekly Briefing. And first of all, welcome back to the program.
Good to be back.
Do want to mention, of course, people are listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com and Top Story with Bill Colley. So we had a number of these elections, and not, as you pointed out in the briefing, not many serious surprises in the races to fill various seats. But apparently, Idaho voters are saying, we might need to spend a little bit more when it comes to our public schools.
The public school funding measures that were on the ballot last week tended to do pretty well. There weren't a tremendous amount of them. Most of the time, you see those in the spring, and that's when the larger number of them tend to be. But very often, those that show up in November are those that have a little bit more of some kind of a problematic nature to them, or maybe the voters have turned them down before. Like in Idaho Falls, they've tried for similar sort of ballot issues 3 times before. Voters turned them down, and this time it passed. And so it went with several others around the state. It was kind of interesting that they did as consistently well as they did.
I was going to say, for people who actually read the briefing, they know this already, but you mentioned this is perhaps a little bit of a bellwether for what's going to happen legislatively coming next year.
Well, it's possible. Certainly, legislators have got to pay attention to what the voters do, and this is kind of an indicator. And it could very well be that legislators who are looking at the question of their constituents voting for significant increases in their local property taxes, which property taxes are really pretty unpopular taxes as these things go. And that may very well be that some are a little bit more encouraged to use sales and income taxes instead to bulk some of that up. But we'll see what happens come the legislative session. That's always a very tough sell.
And that's because everything is either tied into funding higher education or funding the public education, and it seems that that tug of war goes on, and it's difficult sometimes for legislators to. You can't pick both some years. I guess it's a little too lean to do that.
It is, and it's been a struggle back and forth for a lot of years. Usually, public schools tend to win out a little bit more, but then what we see is either cutbacks or very often increases in tuition fees, things like that make colleges and universities a lot more expensive. And of course, we've been hearing a lot about how expensive that is these days. So yeah, it's really kind of a if you win a little bit more here, then you tend to lose a little bit more there.
You have a story today that I thought is one of those half empty, half full type of stories. Conservation efforts obviously have worked well in the sense that the grizzly bear population apparently is doing very well in and out of Yellowstone National Park, and yet on the other hand, more grizzly bears mean and more tourists coming mean more interactions, and those interactions sometimes aren't good. And you reference U.S. Senator Jim Risch having some involvement in this as well. And I guess the question comes down to how do we better manage those interactions?
Yeah, it's not a perfect kind of thing. Grizzly bears are dangerous, obviously, and you have to take some care in how you manage them. At the same time, there aren't a tremendous number of them, and it's not as though you want to do anything like declare open season on them either. So it's kind of a difficult, sensitive sort of thing. In Yellowstone National Park, the number of grizzlies has actually declined a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit, just enough to give people the idea that that you need to take some care in how you manage them, and it is a difficult thing. What Senator Rich was going after was the idea that states ought to have a larger role in managing some of that, and I can imagine that after the sage grouse activities, in which states got a pretty substantial say earlier this year in how some of that was done. I can imagine that states may have a little bit, may be able to get a little larger say in how grizzly bears are managed as well.
I had I think my first interaction with wildlife on Saturday morning since I came to Idaho. I was unloading groceries, had the back gate open, and it looked like a mule deer cut across the street and through someone's backyard, trotted up the street, and then took a left turn to avoid traffic and went straight down the street in another direction. And it looked as if it had been tagged as well. And but it caught me just by not so much surprise, but how quickly it all happened, and the deer seemed so nonchalant about it. They're not obviously going to be as dangerous as saying if I had an encounter with a grizzly bear.
Yeah, quite a bit different, obviously, from that. But it is the case that a lot of larger species of wildlife and people are being thrown a little bit closer together. Between the forest fires and other things that are happening in the environment, there are a lot more instances of this. I think all around the West, people are seeing. I know that's been the case where I am. That more and more you find people and wild animals being thrown together a little bit more.
And the explosive growth too. It's not just Ada and Canyon counties, but we're seeing it I think in the Twin Falls area because of that growth. The more that you build these housing developments and they spread out, the more you're going to have those encounters.
Oh yeah, that's all over the place. It's happened to a degree in the eastern states, but over many of the western states, there are many places where this sort of thing has been happening more and more.
Our guest is Randy Stapilus from Idaho Weekly Briefing. 10 minutes now from 9 o'clock at 44 at our studio. Bill Colley with you as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. There was a story you had a mention of, and of course, I had heard about this last week through Steve Millington when he was in the studio with me one day. Waters of the U.S. rule, and another one of those big fights with the EPA and a lot of your Western representatives and senators, and Senator Mike Crapo not at all pleased about this, and he joined Senate Republicans in basically saying they're going to throw up a roadblock, I guess, against the EPA. Is that a good description?
That's a fair description. Throwing up at least as much of a roadblock as they can, and we'll see how that goes. I suspect there will still be there's been some barrier in the courts that's been thrown up to blocking some of the certain areas anyway of the implementation of the Waters of the United States rule. This is an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency rule that expands somewhat, although not enormously, the reach of what they look at in terms of water quality, not in terms of water rights in the sense that Westerners understand it, but in terms of certain types of water quality, pollution, things like that. But there is some serious question about what a federal agency ought to be looking at in terms of this, and what a state agency ought to be looking at, because state agencies across the country also have a role in protecting water quality. Idaho has the Department of Environmental Quality, which keeps track of that sort of thing as well. And there are a lot of advocates like Senator Crapo and the rest of the delegation in Idaho, for that matter, that want to make sure that the state role isn't being infringed upon. So that will be going on, and it's probably my guess is that there will probably be at some point sort of a negotiated settlement out of that, and that will probably come. But as it is, certainly anything that's federally government related has a lot of negative connotations in Idaho, and certainly Senator Crapo and the rest of the delegation are well aware of that too.
For people who would like to actually, sign up and get the briefing, where would you send them?
I would send them to www.ridenbaugh.com. That's RIDENBAUGH.
I had mentioned to you in an email this morning that this story, tragic story out of Adams County, with the shooting of the rancher and his bull had been in an accident, is getting some national attention. I've had people as far away as Alabama write me and ask me questions about it, and of course, I don't have any answers. Obviously, as the investigation goes on, and we likely a lot of us sitting on this side won't for some time. But I think you would agree that this is truly, truly a tragedy, and there may have been some sort of misunderstanding that took place there.
It's certainly tragic, no doubt about that. There's plenty of tragedy to go around with that case. It's tempting to jump to conclusions, especially after hearing the family's account, which did get out this weekend, of what had happened. There is a fairly detailed account from them that appeared in the Idaho Statesman and several other places. But and they may be exactly right, but I'd like to hear more of the story before kind of drawing a lot of conclusions. It never it's usually not a real good idea to decide where all the right and wrong was in just hearing one side of it. But that kind of suggests too that the other side of it, the law enforcement side of it, which is in this case the side of the county Adams County Sheriff's Office, they really ought to be saying something before long by way of explaining what it was that happened. And the Idaho State Police, which has been looking into it as well, has been tracking down people who were in the area at the time and may have had some independent point of view that may provide corroboration for some of what happened. And eventually, I imagine we'll be hearing some of that. So I guess there's no question that there was a serious tragedy and that something went badly awry. It's probably as well to make sure that everybody has the facts before reaching conclusions on it.
In fact, from what I've read so far, it sounds as if the sheriff is absolutely crushed by this, because the man who's dead now was a popular fellow in the community and well known in the community, and yet we know it was dark, and the bull had been obviously unruly, and it was angry because it had been hit by a car. It could well be that everything that just came down was just a complete miscommunication, and we may have to just chalk it up to that.
That's a possibility. I could imagine several possibilities. The family's account was quite a bit different from that. That they would if the family's account is an accurate representation of what occurred, then there was serious culpability on the part of law enforcement. But that again, there are various ways of interpreting it, and the more information we have, the more we know, the better we'll all be able to assess it. And I imagine that this will be going through the courts at some point or another, so we'll probably have plenty of opportunity to assess it down the road.
A civil action, in other words.
I would imagine that in any event. That would seem to be fairly likely, I would think, of some sort or another. Just based on what we've seen so far. But again, we only have some of the facts right now. We don't have all of them.
In fact, you're probably much more experienced with this because I'm, still a relative newcomer to Idaho. But I would assume that an investigation like this could take several weeks before it's actually complete.
Oh yeah. It will probably take a little while. The people are being found to try to provide additional outside information, people who weren't involved but may have seen some part of it. I'm sure that there will be a good deal of inquiry about it, and with the state police in it, that means that it will probably be fairly deliberate. They will probably not be rushing it too much, and so it will probably be a number of weeks anyway before we start to get to the point where we have about as much information as we're going to get.
Randy Stapilus joining us from Idaho Weekly Briefing. Hey, quickly, I do like to throw this at you once in a while. Any predictions for the next week?
Well, we'll probably be having the some of the new city officials and some of that kind of activities settling in. Although there weren't all that many new city officials, so I, I imagine that we'll probably just see a little bit of a settling down in that regard over this next week.
Well, we'll talk to you again on Monday morning, next Monday morning, and we'll look forward to a few more predictions.
Sounds good.
All
We'll
righty,
talk to you
thank
then.
you. Randy Stapilus joining us from Idaho Weekly Briefing this morning, as he does most Monday mornings right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley on Top Story. News is coming up next from Fox, and of course, one more hour of Top Story as well. Look, I've got to tell you a little bit more about some concerns about people who are gun owners in neighboring Oregon and what they would like to see happen when it comes to their ownership.